أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الحمد لله الذي هدانا لهذا وما كنا لنهتدي لولا أن هدانا الله والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين خاتم النبيين سيدنا الممجد بشير المصدق المصطفى الأمجد محمود الأحمد أبي القاسم محمد اللهم صل على محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين ولعنة الله على الظالمين من الأولين والآخرين أما بعد قال إمام الصادق عليه السلام حديث تدريه خير من ألف حديث ترويه آمنا بالله صدق الله العلي العظيم وصدق رسول الكريم والحمد لله رب العالمين. Awaited Savior of humanity, Imam al-Mahdi alayhi salam, my respected teachers, elders, brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum jami'an wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. أعظم الله أجورنا وأجوركم بمصابنا Imam Muhammadin al-Jawad salawatullah wa salamuhu alayh. First and foremost, our condolences go out to the master of our age, the Lord of our time, Imam al-Mahdi ajjalallahu ta'ala faraj al-sharif. And we also condole all of our scholars, all of our family and friends, our community members, and the whole of humanity, for indeed the martyrdom of any of our imams, salamullahi alayhim ajma'een, is a tragedy for the whole of mankind. The narration that we have recounted comes to us from our 6th Imam alayhi salam. It's a very famous narration, and he says, Hadithun tadrihi khayrun min alfi hadithun tarwihi, that one narration that you understand is better than 1,000 that you narrate. And the beauty of this narration is that it seeks for us to encompass the knowledge that we have, as opposed to only regurgitating that knowledge. In the idea that whatever we obtain, whatever we read, whatever we listen to, there is far more benefit in it if you and I take the time to analyze it from all of its various angles, for it to become part and parcel of us, an essential part of us, an intimate part of us, so that when we speak from that perspective, we have encompassed that knowledge. One narration that you have understood is better than 1,000 that you narrate. And so for you and I, this evening what we would like to do is to look at that most oft narrated story of our 9th Imam alayhi salam, his debate with Yahya ibn Aktham, an imam from an opposing school of thought, and try to analyze it from various different angles. For normally when we hear about this tradition, when we speak about this tradition, we normally use it as a means to prove imamat. And normally we use it as a means to say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala A, appoints his own imam, but B, an imam can be of any age. And so we normally use this narration as a means to prove that an imam can come at any age. The famous age that we hear is 9 years old that the imam had this debate. And so it's a requisite or a precedent for us to be able to go further and say that when a 5-year-old Imam al-Mahdi ajjalallahu ta'ala farj al-sharif rose and ascended to the point of imamat, there is no shock to this. And so we go back into the Quran and we often highlight that even Nabiullah Isa alayhi salam, even just moments or days after his birth, highlights the grandiosity of his choice and that he is able to speak from the position of even being in the cradle. And so we normally look at this particular issue from these angles. And often enough, we limit ourselves and we do not go further into this narration. We do not allow ourselves to understand it from another angle or angles. And so this evening, inshaAllah, in light of that famous tradition from our 6th Imam alayhi salam, we want to understand or try to envelope this tradition in a number of other ways. Now, of course, it should be self-evident as to why we would want to be able to analyze a narration from a number of angles. But just for us to be able to express this in a further way. When you and I want to understand anything, there are levels that we may obtain. There are levels that we may be able to appreciate any aspect of. And the more you and I sit and consider, conceive, ponder of any given matter, the greater the likelihood that the veils between myself and the truth of that matter are likely to be lifted. And so there are those people that when they observe something, they observe it in a manner which another person may not. The Quran and the Ahadith speak about this so much. As an example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Holy Quran, الَّذِينَ يَذْكُرُونَ اللَّهَ قِيَامًا وَقُعُودًا وَعَلَى جُنُوبِهِمْ. What do? There are those people that they are considering and reflecting in every state that they're in, be they standing or sitting or even lying on their sides. Even at the times of rest, as they're going to sleep, you might find them that they're considering and remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that those people who remember Him, standing, sitting and lying on their sides, يَتَفَكَّرُونَ فِي خَلْقِ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ, that they are pondering upon the creation of the heavens and the earth, and they will actually look at this creation and they will say, رَبَّنَا مَا خَلَقْتَ هَذَا بَاطِلًا. My Lord, surely you have not created any of this in vain. That there are those people that when they sit and take time to consider, to conceive any issue, they will have enveloped that matter. They will have cut through that matter. And so often when we speak to those people of profound knowledge, we will come and we will have considered a point. The likeliness is they've already conceived of that point and greater. Why is it that they have got there? Are they innately geniuses? Are they so far ahead of us that they just happen to arrive at those conclusions? Or is it that they have taken time to think about a particular issue? And so because they take this time, they have enveloped the matter. There is a wonderful narration in regards to Isa alayhi salam. He's walking with his companions, and his companions, they come across a dead dog, and this dead dog is rotting, the corpse is rotting. And of course, when the corpse of anything rots, it gives off a very foul smell. And they say, look at this foul smell that is coming from this dog. Isa alayhi salam responds and says, no, look at the beautiful white teeth that this dog has. Look how the teeth are shining from this dog. And how one group of people considered one facet and they looked at this dog from one angle, whereas Isa alayhi salam looked at it from another angle, because he had already conceived of the greatness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I have not looked at this dog from the perspective of how it revolts me and how the stench overcomes me. I look at it that even the beauty of its teeth, there's something to value in this dog. And so of course everything we look at through certain lenses. And so it is important for us to remove the bias of that lens. How do I remove the bias of that lens? Is by taking time to ponder through that particular matter, to see whether that lens has value to it, whether that lens is the correct way for me to have looked at it, whether someone else's lens has a greater perspective of truth than what my lens has. And so, as the 6th Imam says, one narration that you understand is greater than 1,000 that you narrate. So let us remind ourselves of this very famous tradition from our 9th Imam, Imam Muhammadin al-Jawad salawatullah wa salamuhu alayhi. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala ajal farajahu. The narration is lengthy, and although we may hear of it from the perspective of the debate between our Imam and Yahya ibn Aktham, the story in its entirety starts from well before. The Imam, from the age of 7 years and 4 months, according to some narrations, ascends to the honorable position of Imamate. And he is born in the city of Medina and taken from Medina eventually to Baghdad. As he is there, now there is a narration that says that he is playing in the streets. As he's playing in the streets, he is with his other young companions, which in itself shows to us that the Imams played. They may not necessarily have played like you and I have played, but they played in their own way in order to engage the community, in order to build those bonds of relationships, in order to show that they are human like us. The Holy Quran highlights that Rasulullah would say, "Ana basharum mithlakum." I'm a human being like you. Huwa yamshi fil aswaq wa yut'imu at-ta'am. He walks in the marketplaces and he eats and partakes like you and I eat. We're going to come back to this in a few minutes. Hold on to these verses if you will. And so as the Imam is in this engagement, the narration says that a large caravan, a hunting caravan of the Caliph Ma'mun al-Rashid, engages and passes through the street where all of the youngsters are playing. The narration says that the children flee from this caravan in fear, and the Imam sits or holds his position or stands in the middle of the street without that same fear or anxiety that the other children have. And so the caravan stops because the Imam doesn't move. They're not going to run a child over in the middle of the road. And so the Caliph descends from that caravan, stands in front of him and asks, "Why did you not flee like the rest of the children?" The Imam responds by saying, "I saw no reason to fear you." Now from this we may take that the Imam himself may be saying, "I don't fear you because you are the Caliph and I am the Imam." Or he may have been saying that I didn't have reason to fear your caravan, that you would not kill an innocent child in the middle of the street. And so, having heard this wonderful answer from this young child, he says, "Who are you?" And the Imam responds by saying, "Ana ibn al-Rida." I am the son of Imam al-Rida alayhi salam. "What is your name?" "Muhammad." I am Muhammad, the son of Imam al-Rida alayhi salam. And so, of course, having known the personality of Imam al-Rida alayhi salam, and knowing this particular individual as the son of Imam al-Rida alayhi salam, immediately the Caliph knows the grandiosity of this child. We have many narrations to tell us that when the 8th Imam had his young son, he would speak about him in a way in which no other Imam was spoken of. We have narrations that will say that the 8th Imam would introduce his young son by saying, "Hadha al-mawdud al-mubarak." This is the blessed birth that we have been waiting for. And so based upon this, it was probably very well known that the Imam alayhi salam was the Imam of Ahl al-Bayt salamullahi alayhim ajma'een. And so because of this, knowing that this was the Imam, the Caliph wishes to wed him to his young daughter, Fadl. And Fadl is brought to marry this child, and as is the case, when he introduces Imam al-Jawad alayhi salam to all of the advisors, to all of the people, to all of the scholars, they come and respond by saying, "Why would you marry this young child to your daughter? What is it that he has that we do not have? Why do you honor and favor this young child over the rest of us to become your son-in-law?" And so he introduces and says that you don't know about this man, this child. This is the inheritor of Imam al-Rida alayhi salam. He is from the household of Ahl al-Bayt. And so you should not consider him by his young age. Should any of you deny this, why don't you hold a debate between yourselves and this young man? For I predict there will be nothing that he cannot overcome. And so, amongst them, there is one that is called upon or nominated in order to engage the debate with the Imam al-Jawad alayhi salam, famously by the name of Yahya ibn Aktham. Now we will go further into who Yahya ibn Aktham is. But Yahya ibn Aktham is said to have risen to being the chief qadi. Where did he come from? According to some of the histories of our brothers, the Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah, they tell us that Yahya ibn Aktham, he was initially the chief qadi of Basra. And because of his diligence and fame, he rose to becoming the chief qadi on behalf of Ma'mun al-Rashid. And so there is the dialogue that is going to be created between these two individuals. They sit amongst each other in a grand hall, and many hundreds and maybe even thousands of people have gathered in order to listen to this debate between this young child at the age of 9 or maybe even 10 years old and Yahya ibn Aktham. And as they engage with each other, they ask, would you like to go? No, you go ahead. And so Yahya ibn Aktham poses the question and says, may I be ransomed for you? What is the penal code for the one who hunts in the state of ihram? If you become muhrim, if you put on the ihram, what is the responsibility upon the one who hunts in that state? The Imam responds by saying, your question is very vague. Your question is vague because there are so many facets to this question that you have not yet understood. Immediately, Yahya ibn Aktham is dumbfounded by this. What do you mean there are so many facets to this question? And he responds by analyzing this and saying, tell me, is this person who hunts a person who hunts in the state of ihram because it is Hajj or Umrah? Is it a person who is free or is he a slave? Is this his first offense or second offense? Is he someone who hunts around the Kaaba or outside the area of the Kaaba and the Haram? Is he someone who hunts a large animal, a beast, or a small animal? Is he someone who hunts an animal which is winged or an animal which is on the floor? Does he hunt during the day or does he hunt during night? Because every one of these particular facets denotes a different response in the fiqh of Islam. And so, of course, everybody was shocked to hear this grand response from the Imam. And of course, Yahya ibn Aktham didn't have an answer. And so the Imam concluded by answering every facet of how one is responsible having he hunted in that state of ihram. And so, as we stated, our 6th Imam Jaffer as-Sadiq alayhi salam says to us, one narration that you understand is better than 1,000 that you narrate. We come every single year to the wilada, to the istishhad of Imam al-Jawad alayhi salam, and often narrate this particular narration. It is the most famous narration in regards to our Imam. It is greater for us to be able to understand this narration than it is to be able to regurgitate this narration from our tongue. And so, what we have done is just picked 4 aspects of this narration that we can question, that we could try to allude to, for us to be able to maybe take something away differently from only underscoring and repeating the position of imamat and identifying that a young imam can be an imam of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The first thing that we want to mention is that if you notice, the imam both allowed and encouraged dialogue. Now, this may be an obvious point, but it's so necessary for us to be able to understand it in light of what we want to achieve as a wholesome society. For as much as you and I may consider dialogue to be useful, unfortunately there are other mindsets that appear not to engage in dialogue. There are some that prefer banning. There are some that prefer war. There are some that prefer oppression. Whereas if you look at the sunnah of Ahlul Bayt salamullahi alayhim ajma'een, is that their primary go-to position was to engage in dialogue with those who opposed them. And so immediately our go-to position should be the same thing. If you look at the example from all of the imams, they had people who may have been in opposition to them. They may have had people who were antagonistic to them. They had people who claimed to be imams of other schools of thought. Nay, they created other schools of thought. Whereas in our theology, the divinely appointed school of thought is that of the madhab of Ahlul Bayt salamullahi alayhim ajma'een. How is it that they responded? Did they swear, kick, scream? Did they insult the muqaddisat of other schools of thought? No, absolutely not. Rather the opposite. They engaged directly, number one, or they taught students to engage directly, number two. And so if you find any speaker, any scholar, be he from within the school of Ahlul Bayt or outside the school of Ahlul Bayt, who chooses to engage in another manner, this is in opposition to the sunnah of Ahlul Bayt, salamullahi alayhim ajma'een. Unfortunately, even within our school of thought, we have people today that are not engaging directly. Their preference is to make videos that antagonize others. Their preference is to speak about others in a manner which is unbefitting, without akhlaq. This is not the way of Ahlul Bayt, salamullahi alayhim ajma'een. And so, if you look at every one of the Imams, they had antagonizers. Or they had people who were speaking directly in opposition to what they had to say. As an example, our second Imam, an example all the way to our fourth Imam, salamullahi alayhima. During their period of time, I'm just picking as an example, they had someone by the name of Hasan al-Basri. Hasan al-Basri was a very famous scholar of his time, a very famous mystic until today. And many of his works, many of his statements are honored by many schools of thought. There is a narration that says one day, our fourth Imam, Zainul Abidin, salawatullah wa salamuhu alayhi, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa is sitting in his house. One of his companions returns from Masjid Nabawi. And he comes and says to the fourth Imam, Hasan al-Basri is sitting inside the masjid giving dars, giving his lessons. And he said something that troubles me. I don't know how to respond. I don't have an answer for it. Faddalu, go ahead. What is the question? He says, Hasan al-Basri said, I wonder at God. I wonder at God and I wonder upon His characteristics and how He may be so vengeful, such that I wonder how anyone will get to heaven. I wonder at God that He has that ability to punish and take vengeance on someone's actions. And as such, because we are such sinners, or I at least am such a sinner, and so much is done in opposition to God, I wonder how it might be that any of us will ever get to heaven. Imam Zainul Abidin alayhi salam doesn't say, how dare he, ban him. He doesn't say, how dare he, who is this person that speaks? How dare he, does he not know that I am the Imam of everything in creation? He says, go back and tell him. Zainul Abidin responds and says, I also wonder at God, but I wonder at His mercy, such that I wonder how anyone will get to the gates of hellfire. And so immediately the Imam responds. He teaches Hasan al-Basri how to think in a different manner. This is from every example of every one of the Imams, salamullahi alayhim ajma'een, that whenever there was someone in opposition, they spoke and they did due diligence upon that individual by giving them the opportunity to speak. It might have been that Yahya ibn Aktham could have said, Ma'mun has chosen me to be his son-in-law. My father is such and such and my lineage is such and such. From me will come such and such. Who are you to come and engage me in dialogue? This wasn't the way. He engaged Yahya ibn Aktham. And so this notion within our community that when I find a speaker, an alim, a student, or even a marja that I have a disagreement with intellectually, unfortunately until today there is this notion that we should ban him. I don't like what he has to say. He's speaking too mystical. I don't like what he has to say. It's in line with Sufism. I don't like what he has to say. He's a controversial marja. There's a poverty of thought that is being set by certain people that want to curtail discourse. When we engage with them, the methodology is to prove that Ahlul Bayt, salamullahi alayhim ajma'in, sunnah was never to ban someone, whether they were in political authority or otherwise. They preferred direct engagement in dialogue. And this is the first thing that we take away from the dialogue between Imam al-Jawad alayhi salam and Yahya ibn Aktham. Number one. Number two, the second thing is that Yahya ibn Aktham, he asks a question. What was his question? He wants to know, what is the jurisprudential view upon someone who hunts in the state of ihram? And of course, Imam al-Jawad alayhi salam responds by saying this question is vague because there are so many facets to it, and begins to list all the various facets to this particular question. What does this show us? Again, we respond by contemplating on the entirety of the narration. It shows us that Yahya ibn Aktham hadn't encompassed the question himself. He was asking a question, having not taken the time to fathom the question himself. It shows us that he hadn't comprehended it. Now this is important because our go-to position is to criticize or even mock Yahya ibn Aktham and say, look at him, he asked this question and look at what the Imam did, he destroyed him, he showed him the various aspects of this question. But here the lesson should be for you and I, not just to marvel at the response from Imam al-Jawad alayhi salam, but to also ensure that we don't fall short in the same way that Yahya ibn Aktham fell short. Often enough, when we have a question, it might be that our go-to response is that when the speaker comes, or when I have an opportunity to engage in dialogue with someone, my question would be, immediately I go and ask the question. And unfortunately, this is something that is rampant amongst some of our youth. That they have questions, and rightly so. And we have the normal questions. Can I shake hands with a non-mahram? Can I eat from the hand of a Hindu? Will a non-Muslim go to heaven? Yes, you have all these questions that normally come up from amongst the youth, and inshallah more profound questions as well. When these questions come up, often, too often enough, what we do is we go and ask the speaker, or we go and ask the first alim we can get hold of. We text him or her, we say, what is the answer to this question? Yahya ibn Aktham essentially did the same thing. Whether he studied the night before and went through the books of fiqh, or he didn't, or whether this was the question that perplexed him, or whether he had heard it from his teachers, he himself hadn't encompassed that question. Otherwise, if he had sat and pondered and thought about the practical aspects of that question, he would have seen what the Imam had also seen. He wouldn't have allowed that vagueness, that paucity, or that vacuum of that question to come to him. It couldn't have been that he wouldn't have thought about it. He should have sat and thought about it himself. And had he taken himself to being someone in ihram, immediately being a muhrim, he would have said to himself, there are any given number of circumstances that could affect me within this question. And so I won't ask this question because I haven't even comprehended the question myself. And so what shows, or what is evident to you and I, that before I go and ask the question, the first thing for me is to sit down and think about it for myself. Have I encompassed this matter from its theological perspective, from its philosophical perspective? What books are there available to me? What websites are there available to me? What discourses are there available to me on the internet, in my library? What verses, what lessons have I already been to that I may recount and study and obtain so that I may answer the question, or I may find the answer to the question? You see here, why is this important? This is important because generally, this is a reflection, and you can agree or disagree, generally in our community, we have stopped being a reading community. We are very quick to seek our replies nowadays. We're a community that goes very quickly from one place to another. You know, there's a saying about large cities, and particularly New York, they say that they have a New York minute. A New York minute is very, very quick because everything's happening so fast in New York. It rushes. You're rushing from one place to another. There's never a time to relax. And I imagine for many of us, the same thing is in London. We're bouncing from here to work, from work to home to majlis, going out to this friend's house. Everything is very, very quick. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala criticizes this in Quran, in Surah Al-Isra, chapter 17 of the Holy Quran, where he says, وَكَانَ الْإِنسَانُ عَجُولًا. Most surely mankind is very hasty. Slow down. Relax. Take your time. And if we want to inculcate a reading, reflective community, one that is not reliant upon the incoming speaker to answer those questions, whereby we would research for ourselves, make the most of the availability of those discourses, then we wouldn't be like Yahya ibn Aktham. We would try to encompass the question ourselves before we go in spontaneously ask that question. This practice and inculcating this practice within our youth, our children, that the moment they rush and ask a question, how do I deal with this situation? What does Islam say about this? What would you do in a given circumstance? Instead of responding, we would say, what do you think the answer is? Where have you researched the answer first? Now here many of us are teachers, be it in madrasa or school or in some sort of community dialogue, some format. How often we get questions from any range of the spectrum, any issue, anything to do with community, politics, economics, religion. How often immediately we want to give our response, as opposed to training the mind and saying, come back to me with 3 potential answers. Research, come back to me, and we can discuss and debate the issue together. And this is something that we want to inculcate within the next generation so that we become a more reading-based community within our deen. This is the second thing. Yahya ibn Aktham hadn't comprehended his own question before he asked the question to Imam al-Jawad alayhi salam. The third, I pose you a question here. It's not rhetorical. I want you to help me. Assume for a minute that Yahya ibn Aktham had 3 days to prepare for this debate. Assume for a minute he had 1 night to prepare for this debate. And knowing that, ministers are going to be there, knowing that his fellow students are going to be there, the aristocrats of Baghdad are going to be there, of course he would prepare for this debate and dialogue. He chose his question specifically, didn't he? He didn't just haphazardly pick it out of a hat that morning and say, that's a nice question. So I ask you, why did he choose that question? Think about it for a second. And if you wish to engage, give us an answer. Why did Yahya ibn Aktham choose that question in order to stump the 9th Imam? Why didn't he ask something on tafsir? Why didn't he ask something on akhlaq? Why didn't he ask something about Plato? Why that question? Any answers? You're itching, you wanted to give something. I'm going to postulate, because what we're doing here is we're trying to think, we're reflecting. I'm going to give an answer. And I could be wrong, because only Allah maybe really knows. He looked at his opponent and tried to imagine in a debate what weaknesses my opponent would have. And so, based upon my strength and his weakness, I must ask him a question that is going to stump him. Would that be a fair response? He's not going to ask him something that he knows Imam al-Jawad alayhi salam has comprehended. And so if he thought Imam al-Jawad alayhi salam would be a master of tafsir, he wouldn't ask him a question on tafsir. If he was a master philosopher, he wouldn't ask him about Plato, Aristotle, and Socrates. And so, what did he do? He observed his opponent that was a 9 or maximum 10-year-old child, and thought to himself, what should I ask a 9-year-old child that he hasn't yet encompassed? What is he not yet comprehended by virtue of his age, or the paucity of his age, the freshness of his life? And so, using that, I can undermine him, because he won't have understood this question. And so, looking at a 9-year-old, he possibly thought to himself, in his lifespan, he hasn't been to Hajj. He possibly hasn't been on Umrah. And so, maybe he researched and asked around, do you know this boy, Muhammad, son of Ar-Rida, has he been to Hajj? And maybe they said, no, he hasn't been to Hajj. How can he have been to Hajj? Hajj isn't wajib upon him. He's too young to go to Hajj. It may have been any sort of response. No, we hear the response, he hasn't been on Hajj. Excellent. Now that I know he hasn't been, or he's too young to have been, I ask him in this. Let me give it to you in this way. I'm not a parent. And so often, if I go to give a speech, sometimes someone will ask a question on parenthood. Is it wise for me to give an answer? It's not wise. I may have book knowledge. I may have said, well, I've read that theoretically this is what you should do. But I tell you what, a parent who has experienced bringing up a child will have infinitely more experience than me, wisdom than me. Right? Someone who isn't married, it's often I see young speakers, they're not married, and they go on the pulpit and for 45 minutes they give a lecture on marriage. And I think it's great, you have encompassed the knowledge theoretically, but you've never had a fight with your wife. And so you don't know how to deal with it practically, fair? Yes? So here, the Imam possibly was looked at in relation to his age. He said, he's 9 years old, he hasn't been on Hajj, I'll ask him about Ihram. Now, that immediately shows us that the Imam responded with the right answer, obviously from our perspective, because the Imam is someone who is the Imam. But what it also shows us that you and I, as individuals, if we do not have knowledge of something, we should not be responding of it. Very often we have partial knowledge of something. Very often we have shallow knowledge of something. And so when we're asked of something, we may end up answering that particular question. The reality of which, unfortunately, is we haven't truly fathomed that issue. If that's the case, we should not be speaking. Our 9th Imam gives us a wonderful hadith where he says, "Lo sakat al-jahil ma ikhtalafa an-nas." Had the ignorant person just remained silent when he didn't know, there would be no differences amongst people. People wouldn't have been split up into their various knowledges. We wouldn't have this situation, this problem in humanity of so much difference and breadth and animosity between people if the ignorant, the one who didn't know, had just stayed silent. And so the 9th Imam shows us that his age is very important because he himself was going to be undermined by his age. It was because he was an Imam that he had the ability to respond. Now this is interesting because it poses us a further question. Our Imam, if he was 9 and hadn't been on Hajj, it shows us that theoretically he shouldn't have known the answer, theoretically. Obviously, he's an Imam, so we know how he gets the answer, or that he does have the answer, right? But assume for a minute, let's just think about this for a second. How does the Imam get his answer? Assuming he hadn't been on Hajj, how does he get his answer? There is many narrations, and I'll just give you one or two, inshallah, from our theological books. One, for example, a companion of our 6th Imam alayhi salam by the name of Hassan ibn Yahya al-Madaini. He asks our 6th Imam alayhi salam, أخبرني عن الإمام إذ سئل. I'm just trying to find it, inshallah. إذ سئل كيف يجيب. If the Imam, inform me that if you need to know something, if you're asked a question, how do you respond? How do you get your answers? If you have a question, if I ask you a question, how do you respond? فقال, the Imam responds, إلهام وسماع وربما كان جميعا. It's one of three options. I get ilham, I get inspiration, wasama'a, or I get revelation as such, I get from revelation, وَرُبَّمَا كَانَ جَمِيعًا, or it might be something of both of them. It might be either one or some other way. It might be between these two aspects, or a kind of both of these aspects. So this poses us a further question. The Imam, being 9 years old, hadn't gone on Hajj, we now assume, and he's asked this question. Theoretically, he shouldn't have known the answer because he hadn't been. If he doesn't know, how does he know? I have it immediately. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives it to me. And in fact, this is another narration that we find in Surah Al-Kahfi. If I want to know something, I immediately know it. Allah reveals it to me. We have many narrations about ilm al-ghayb and how Ahl al-Bayt, salamullahi alayhim, obtain knowledge. So I'm going to ask you a question, because we're trying to encompass this narration, look at it from all its various angles. Is that the only way the Imam knows? What's our belief system here? Every time the Imam is asked a question, does he just get the answer? Kind of like in the Matrix when, Neo needs to learn how to ride a bike or fly a helicopter, that it's given to him. Is that all the Imam is? That he's a puppet? That when a question comes, he's just given the inspiration to the answer? Or is there another facet to the Imam? Now we said at the beginning of the discourse that Ahl al-Bayt, salamullahi alayhim ajma'een, through the verses of the Quran, demonstrate that they have a human side to them. So the question is, are they more divine and less human? Are they more human and less divine? Or are they between the two? Amrahum bayna amrayn. Are they something between the two of them? It opens up a world of questions. The Imam was 9 years old. He potentially had not been on Hajj. And so he had not ever engaged this question, potentially. He may not have studied this question, but he received the answer. The moment he needs to know, he gets the ilham. If that's the case, if the only way the Imam bases his answers is solely upon ilham, then how is it possible for you and I to follow him? Because you and I do not obtain our answers in the same way that the Imam obtains his answers. Can you see that? We take the Imam to be an exemplar for us, which means I should be able to follow him. If his entire life is based that when something happens, any given issue happens, he just bases his response on inspiration, then how do I use him as an exemplar? Because I can't do the same thing. Rather, what you and I do is base ourselves on pure rational reasoning. We say to ourselves that when A, B, C, and D occur, then I have a given set number of choices. I can choose this direction or this direction. I am accountable through my choices. If the Imam is always reliant upon ilham, then he can't be accountable to his choices. Can you see the issue? And so we have to find our position and ask ourselves theologically, where are we on this matter? The Imam, one may argue, is at least part rational, if not more rational, than basing himself on response of ilham and revelation. How so? Let us ask ourselves and ponder upon it. We take an incident that is so famous so that we all know it. so that there's no disputation on it, and base our thinking process off this. The incident of Husayn ibn Ali salawatullah wa salamuhu alayhi Sayyid al-Shuhada. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa alihi wa ajil. The narrations tell us that when he is in the city of Medina, he receives hundreds of letters per day asking him to rise against the Caliph, Yazid ibn Muawiyah. One narration says to us that on one day alone, he received 700 letters in a sack. That's a lot if you imagine that from around the ummah, how they would be writing letters, that in one day to receive 700. Now, as we know, places like Egypt were strongholds for Ahlul Bayt, and around the ummah they were receiving letters. So number one, rationally speaking, Husayn ibn Ali alayhi salam sees that he has support from around the ummah geographically. Number one. Number two, as a rational person, what would he say? He would say to himself, Yazid ibn Muawiyah is based where? Damascus. There is a stronghold, a fort in Kufa. If I'm going to overthrow Damascus, I need Kufa alongside me. And so when he receives hundreds of letters from Kufa, what does he do? He dispatches his ambassador, Muslim ibn Aqil alayhi salam. Muslim gets there, and as we know, initially, thousands of people respond to him to the extent that he writes his letter to Husayn ibn Ali and says, I have 18,000 swords with me. When Husayn ibn Ali alayhi salam receives that letter, rationally speaking, what would he do? He would know that strategically, if I take Kufa, I have a great army against Damascus. I have received 18,000 letters, or I have the pledge of 18,000 swords rather. Let me set off to Kufa, which is what he does. It's only en route to Kufa does he receive the news that Muslim ibn Aqil has been beheaded. And then he is intercepted by the army. Now here we can say that the Imam is basing his decisions on ilham. Or we can say that the Imam is rationally deducing, step by step, the best outcome. His goal was what? To become a martyr, or his goal was to overthrow Yazid and establish a righteous government? Of course, his goal was to establish a righteous government. And so his aim is that, and he uses his rational deduction to get there. What this shows us is, in our terminology, that the Imams were mujtahideen. They were people who strove to arrive at a position. They can resort to ilham when they need, but their primary responsibility is not to base their life's movements on ilham. Their primary responsibility is to base them on rational deduction. Otherwise, you and I cannot take them as exemplars. Now, this changes the narrative, the discourse that so often we hear, that they're acting in a certain way. How can I follow the Imam? Because he's a rational human being like I am a rational human being. Adds so many questions. But you get this through the discourse of the 9th Imam. Because the 9th Imam, did he study this issue? Had he already been on Hajj to encompass it or not? This is the third aspect. The fourth and final aspect about this particular debate is Yahya ibn Aktham. What happens? Yahya ibn Aktham loses the debate. Our logical question should be, well, what happened after to Yahya ibn Aktham? If I want to encompass this narration, hadithun tadrihi khayrun min alfi hadithun tarwihi, if I want to encompass this narration, I don't just stop by asking about the 9th Imam. I ask about Yahya ibn Aktham himself. Who was he? What happened to him? What was his outcome? Now here there is history to talk about Yahya because he's a famous qadi of that time. Interestingly enough, the narrations tell us that, or the history tells us, that he took the position of being chief qadi in 202 after Hijrah. He was 22 years old. He was born in 180 after Hijrah. The Imam was born 195 after Hijrah, meaning that there was only a small gap between them. Now, one may be cynical and say the historians have made Yahya ibn Aktham younger in order to not embarrass him so much being defeated by a 9-year-old. I could be cynical in history and I could argue that point. However, I don't have evidence to back that. What we do have is the history of who he trained under and which scholars and which sect he followed. It is said that he followed the Hanafi school of thought. In any case, he is said to have been 30 years old or 25 years old. And as such, it was a 9-year-old debating against a 25-year-old. It's very interesting to imagine that particular event now. Instead of thinking him of a very elder, grey sheikh, maybe, 60 years old. It changes the dynamics. What happened to him? The history says after he lost this particular debate, soon after, he fell out with Ma'mun al-Rashid. As you can imagine. According to history, there was some financial or fiduciary incompetence on his side, and this was made as an excuse to get rid of him from being chief qadi. What happened? The history says that after Ma'mun died, the next caliph is whom? Al-Mu'tasim. After Mu'tasim comes in, he appoints him to being chief qadi again. What does that show you? It shows you that despite you having lost to a 9-year-old imam and accepting that your knowledge was never sufficient to debate him, yet you took the position of being chief qadi again. You hadn't learned from your mistakes. It's a huge issue. And so we continue and we see that for us, again, not to become like Yahya ibn Aktham, the first one was, do not be someone who doesn't encompass their knowledge and the paucity of that question. But the second one is to learn from our own mistakes. The hadith is very simple. Amir al-Mu'mineen Ali ibn Abi Talib salawatullahu salamuhu alayhi is narrated to have said, at loss is the one who commits a mistake and doesn't learn from it. And so Yahya ibn Aktham's ending was under the servitude of another caliph in opposition to Ahlul Bayt salamullahi alayhim ajma'een. Here we highlight that this event is so famous and there's so much of it that we know, but there's so much for us to explore off it as offshoots for this famous event. As Imam Sadiq alayhi salam tells us, that we should encompass that knowledge and try to be of people that ponder and reflect on any given narration, because if we understand it, it is better than if we narrate it. The narration tells us that our 9th Imam was in a gathering, and this was to be the cause of his demise. The debate stood on how do we deal with someone who has been a thief. From where do we cut the hand or the arm? Do we cut from here? Do we cut from here? Do we cut from here? And so each of the scholars of Banu Abbas gave their own answer. And the question came to the 9th Imam alayhi salam, whereby he said, you should cut from here because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala still desires that the person who does sajda can still place his hand on the place of sajda. This answer is said to have enraged some of the scholars who had been in opposition to this answer. And so they had demanded that now we end the life of a 25-year-old Imam al-Jawad alayhi salam. And so the Caliph Mu'tasim comes to his niece, his great niece, Fadl, the wife of Imam alayhi salam, and gives to her some poison. That poison is placed in the food of the 9th Imam, and the 9th Imam eats and partakes from that food. The narrations tell us that it enters into his body and cuts his liver up. One narration tells us that in the final moments of his life, he opens the Quran and from the Quran begins to read. And the last words of his in this transient world are the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that is how he demised. 1 week ago, 8 days ago, we heard the news that there were bomb attacks and mortar attacks upon the shrine of our 9th Imam alayhi salam. And there was a bomb outside, and afterwards mortars hit the haram, and there was the attack upon the haram. We will say to the Imam that in his life, just as in his death, he is madhloom, and that after his life, the coverings of the 9th Imam were attacked. But we also remember his great auntie Sayyidah Zainab alayhi salam, that in her life, her coverings were attacked. Not only coverings attacked in death, in her shrine, but even in her lifetime, her coverings were attacked. To the extent that on the 11th of Muharram, her tents were set ablaze. There's one narration which says that one of the men looking and observing the incident of the 10th and the 11th of Muharram narrates that as the tents were ablaze, I saw children running from tent to tent, trying to put the fire out from their clothes. And I saw one incident that astounded me. I saw a woman running out of a burning tent and running back into that burning tent. Out of this burning tent and into this burning tent. As she exited the tent, she would stand and look up towards the sky as if to be calling towards God. And as she entered into the tent, she lasted so long in that tent that I feared that the tent would burn her whilst she was inside it. Eventually, as she exited the tent, I saw, almost in a silhouette like, her carrying a man upon her shoulders, dragging a man out of that burning tent. And so I ran towards her and asked her, "Who are you and who is this man?" She says, "I am Zainab bint Ali, and this is the Imam of the time, Ali ibn al-Hussein Zain al-Abidin. He is too ill to stand up under his own strength, and so I carry him out of the burning tents." ألا لعنة الله على القوم الظالمين وسيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون إنا لله وإنا إليه راجعون. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to hasten the reappearance of the awaited Savior, to allow us to be alongside him at all times in our life and in our death. If we're to pass away from this world before his coming, to raise us from our graves so that we may partake in the victory of Muhammad and Ali Muhammad. Ya Allah, we ask you for the opportunity to perform the ziyarah of our 9th Imam this year and every year, inshaAllah. And we ask on his behalf and through his wasila, all those people around the world who are going through such desperate times, those people who are in a state of war and oppression, homelessness and poverty, lack of education and medicines, and natural disaster, to grant them more safety, security, and victory for the sake of Muhammad and Ali Muhammad. Wassalamu alaikum jami'an wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Just before we have question and answers, can we please recite Surah Fatiha for the cousin of Kashish? She comes to the Mahfil Ali sometimes. Her cousin passed away. His name was Sayyid Hassan Rizvi. Surah Fatiha.
Bismillah.
And before we go on question and answers, just a reminder for our upcoming programs. Every Thursday we have Dua Kumal followed by Salah at 8 o'clock. We have Fajr Salah every Sunday followed by Salam Center meeting at 6:30 a.m. Every Saturday we have tuition classes here at 9:30, and Husseini Madrasa is every Sunday at No Hill High School at 9:45. Yoga is every Tuesday at 7 o'clock till 8, and every Wednesday 9:45 a.m. to 12 is Mothers and Toddlers session. We will be starting football sessions again on Saturday evening. For any of these programs or anything else, please look at the mailing list or the website, or get in touch with someone on the executive committee. Any questions from either side?
He says we're pondering.
I'll start then. So you said that obviously we have to be very careful about speaking about things that we don't have experiential knowledge of, or we have to be wary of that when we do so. How does that work when it comes to male maraja talking about women's issues?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I recall that Allama Sayyid Muhammad Sayyid Tabatabai, rahmatullahi alayhi, had a female teacher specifically for these matters. And I think it behooves a scholar to take guidance from areas that they possibly cannot and cannot possibly have full experience on. And so in a system of ijtihad, they may benefit from guidance in areas that they are not experts on. Traditionally, our scholars have a set system which requires them to be masters of Arabic language, theology, logic, usul al-fiqh, ilm al-hadith, and tafsir. And so, in modern issues, it may be issues of physiology, psychology, it may be issues of economics, it may be issues in regards to women. My humble imagination would be that it would be befitting for a holistic system to gain benefit from other areas.
Thank you.
Very diplomatic.
Just along the same lines of what Muqtad asked, what about teachers in madrasa? So if I'm a teacher in madrasa, I now need to step down because I don't have enough knowledge to be able to answer the questions that the kids pose. Do I step down, or do I just say, actually, I know something, so I'll teach you what I know, and if I don't know it, then speak to someone else?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Our humble advice would be that if they ask a question the same way to me, if someone asks me a question, there is no embarrassment in saying, I don't know, I will come back to you. It doesn't mean that a person steps down from madrasa. No, we need teachers. There is nobody that is going to be Jami' al-Shara'i of, he's going to encompass the entirety of every knowledge in the madrasa. It's very unlikely that is the case. If there is a question that stumbles you, don't be embarrassed. That's a good thing. It gives you and I the opportunity to A, prove our humility, and B, to go away and actually improve ourselves by learning the new thing.
Just on that point, I got your point saying that somebody who is a parent has a little bit more wisdom when relating or narrating any issues around children. But conversely, you see lots of practitioners, or sounds awful, but to say this super nanny that's on television has absolutely no children, but is a much better parent at bringing up children. So she doesn't have necessarily any children, but her skill set is there. So what are your comments on that? Does it necessarily have to be somebody that is...
No. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. It would appear, and I'm not saying I've watched too many of those shows, however, it would appear that they have been exposed to children, both practically, but also they have been studying child psychology, they have studied something in those remits. And so they still speak from a place of experience. They still speak from a place of wisdom. My point was that I don't have children often. I don't have, if someone comes and asks me, I feel a little bit embarrassed to give advice when I don't have the experience. So it was just that balancing point. But in regards to those people on TV, I do believe they do have the experience. Otherwise, they wouldn't be given such prominence.
Basically, my question is that, we believe that our imams have ilm-e-ghaib and they know everything. And, but it's a bit surprising that, they have all chosen wives in one way or another that are going to sort of poison them, or, but like I know the general answer for this question is that, you know, it was for us to learn from history, but wouldn't they have, like, we would also have learned from better examples of wives, you know, from better, you know, better sort of scenarios.
I completely
almost.
see that point.
Yeah, but it's just a bit surprising.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I would just address something you said at the beginning,
Sure.
where you said that the Imams know everything. I would just qualify that and say that there are certain things that are kept from them, or that they don't have absolute encompassing knowledge of. Yes, the standard go-to theological answer is that they knew that they had had wives that were going to do such and such, and it was a test. It was to create reconciliation between tribes. It was a political marriage. We have all the various different answers. You see, here, again, I'm not challenging our fundamentals or challenging the popular narrative. I'm going to ask, did the Imam know that Fadl was going to martyr him before he got married to her? Did he? And I'm saying it generally, I'm not saying him specifically. Did Imam al-Hasan alayhi salam know about Ju'ta bint Ash'ath? Did he know? Now you could argue, yes, he did know. Is it a deficiency if he didn't know? We normally would say, or the go-to response is, well, how can he not know? That means he has a deficiency. No, it's not a deficiency. It means that he
Was more like us.
It means that he was more like us. It means that he based his decisions on certain rationale. Now here there are many arguments to prove this from the Quran, and I'll just give one. And again, you're open to debate the issue with me, and I'm just going through this with you. The story of Ya'qub alayhi salam and Yusuf alayhi salam. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Ya abati, inni ra'aytu ahada ashara kawkaban wa shamsu ra'aytuhu li sajidin. Oh my dear father, I see as if that the stars are doing sajda to me, right? What's the response from Ya'qub alayhi salam? He says, Ya bunayya la taqsus ru'yaka ala ikhwatika fayakidu laka kayda. Don't narrate your story, right? Why? Because shaitan will use this. Now, they come to Ya'qub alayhi salam and say, we want to take Yusuf racing. I ask you, does Ya'qub know that they're lying? He knows they're lying, right? Then they come back and they have ripped a shirt and they took some wolf's blood and the wolf got him. Ya'qub alayhi salam knows he's in the well. He could have said, what are you lying for? He's in the well, go bring him back. He could have said that. So there was a part there. Now, why did he respond the way he responded? We would say that he was following a plan of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that desired Yusuf alayhi salam to be in the well so he can go to Egypt, so. Fine. That part is ilham. We can't follow Ya'qub alayhi salam unless you and I also have mastered the removal of the veils. But here comes the kicker. Because he's crying, isn't he? Why is he crying?
If he knows, yeah.
If he knows Yusuf alayhi salam is safe, and this is going to be the blossoming of Yusuf alayhi salam, why cry so much until the whites of his eyes come? Because he genuinely felt that pain of separation. So there's a part of him which is based upon his human instinct, which I termed as, for the sake of the discussion, the rationale, his aqal. However, there's a part of him that is based upon ilham. There's a balance between the two. And there's a time, the Arafah will say that anyone who's reached to the point of reaching ilm al-ghaib, there is a huge level of responsibility upon them as to when they use that, when they try to tap into that, when they're allowed to use that subjectivity. And the rest of the time, they're obliged to follow their rational reasoning. So on that basis, the Imams may have married wives on rational reasoning. It may have been that they knew and they were ordered by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to follow it. This is a theology that you and I will have to wrangle with.
Thanks.
Any final questions? Okay, I think we'll end there.
Thank you.
Salawat.
Allah.